In the pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific on November 28, 1944, the colossal carrier Shinano slipped out of the Yokosuka naval arsenal under a veil of secrecy. Shinano was the largest carrier ever built up to that time and Japan's newest naval marvel, her crew unaware that within hours they would be fighting for their lives. Nearby, lurking beneath the waves, the American submarine USS Archerfish silently trailed the carrier's zigzagging silhouette. The stage was set for an unprecedented encounter, a duel between the world's biggest carrier and a lone submarine. How did this top-secret supercarrier, believed by her makers to be nearly unsinkable, end up at the bottom of the ocean on her very first voyage? This is the story of Shinano's only mission, a tale of ambitious design, desperate secrecy, and fatal miscalculation that culminated in one of World War II's most dramatic naval blunders. Shinano's story began with the Yamato-class battleships, an embodiment of Imperial Japan's naval might. Laid down on May 4, 1940, Shinano was originally intended to be the third super battleship in the Yamato class, alongside her sister ships Yamato and Musashi. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 saw Japan lose 4 of its fleet aircraft carriers, Akagi, Hiryu, Kaga, and Soryu, in a single battle. In the aftermath, Japan's naval planners urgently needed to rebuild carrier strength. So, even as Shinano's hull rose on the slipway as a battleship, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a dramatic decision: convert Shinano into an aircraft carrier rather than finish her out as a battleship. Her partially built hull provided a massive, armoured foundation for what they hoped would be an unparalleled carrier. This was no easy redesign. The conversion was almost as challenging as starting from scratch. Shinano's conversion took over 2 years, a process slowed by resource shortages and Allied air raids. The advanced state of her battleship construction meant she couldn't become a traditional fleet carrier with multiple hangar decks like purpose-built carriers. Instead, designers turned Shinano into a support carrier, essentially a giant floating fortress and resupply ship for Japan's remaining carriers. She would carry reserve aircraft, fuel, and munitions to sustain other carriers in battle, as well as launch a limited air wing of her own if needed. Her single hangar deck and slightly shorter flight deck reflected this specialized role. Built on a Yamato-class hull, Shinano was immense in size. She measured about 872 feet in length and displaced roughly 70,000 tons at full load, by far the largest aircraft carrier of World War II. Shinano's defensive armament was formidable as well, with 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns and over 100 anti-aircraft guns. Yet for all her size and strength, Shinano was also a product of haste and compromise. The conversion was rushed as Japan's war fortunes worsened. By late 1944, construction was behind schedule. Originally expected to be completed in 1945, Shinano's finishing work was pushed forward after another major defeat in mid-1944 left Japan desperate for new warships. Shortages of materials and skilled labor led to many shortcuts. Still, by November 1944, the massive carrier was deemed just ready enough for a trial voyage, even if she was not truly combat ready. From the outset, Shinano's existence was kept top secret. Her construction at Yokosuka was hidden behind high fences and tight security. Workers were confined to the naval yard and forbidden from talking about what they were building. This veil of secrecy was so effective that no official photographs of Shinano were taken during construction. Only a few clandestine snapshots exist, one by a Japanese plane to check her camouflage, and one by a high-flying American B-29. Strategically, Shinano was meant to be Japan's trump card after the carrier losses at Midway. If the Allies learned of her, she'd become a prime target before ever seeing battle. Thus, Japanese high command wanted Shinano hidden until she could make a difference in a decisive engagement. They envisioned her as a pivotal support unit for the defensive battles to come. Shinano could ferry dozens of replacement aircraft, stockpile huge amounts of fuel and ordnance, and even carry specialized kamikaze weapons like rocket-powered Oka gliders. In essence, she would be a mobile logistics base and backup carrier to keep Japan's remaining fleet carriers in the fight. By late 1944, however, time was running out. The US Navy's advance across the Pacific had brought the war to Japan's doorstep, and Yokosuka was growing vulnerable to air attack. Japanese leaders decided to move Shinano to the safer Kure naval base in western Japan to complete her fitting out. The transfer would also allow Shinano to pick up a load of new weapons bound for the front lines. Secrecy remained paramount. Japan did not announce Shinano's commissioning to the public, and her maiden voyage would be under strict radio silence and cover of darkness. On November 19, 1944, Shinano was commissioned at Yokosuka, just 10 days before her sinking. Captain Toshio Abe, a seasoned officer, took command of the ship and its crew of about 2,000. He quickly saw that the gigantic carrier was far from battle-ready. Workers were still crawling over Shinano, installing equipment and finishing critical systems. Many of her watertight doors and bulkheads were incomplete or untested, a serious safety risk. Pumps and damage control gear were missing or not fully functional. Captain Toshio Abe, alarmed by these problems, pleaded for more time to conduct sea trials and ensure the ship was seaworthy. But Navy High Command was adamant. Shinano must sail to Kure immediately to get her out of vulnerable Yokosuka. The threat of a catastrophic air raid on the shipyard loomed larger in their minds than the danger of sending an unfinished ship to sea. In the frantic days before departure, Shinano's crew worked around the clock alongside hundreds of civilian yard workers to prepare. The ship was loaded with 50 Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka kamikaze rocket gliders and several Shinyo suicide boats, special attack craft being ferried for use in upcoming battles. These were crammed into her hangar and on deck, effectively turning the carrier into a transport for kamikaze weapons on this trip. Importantly, Shinano did not yet have her own air group aboard. Her complement of carrier aircraft and trained pilots would come later, after additional training. So on this maiden voyage, Shinano was essentially a massive armed ferry without any aircraft of her own. By the afternoon of November 28, 1944, Shinano was hastily declared fit for sea. At 6 p.m. that evening, she slipped out of Yokosuka and headed into the night, flanked by her 3 destroyer escorts, Yukikaze, Isukaze, and Hamakaze. The departure was anticlimactic. No ceremony or fanfare, just the huge silhouette gliding away from the dock as anxious workers looked on. Once clear of Tokyo Bay, Shinano set a southwesterly course into the Philippine Sea, planning to swing around southern Japan and then cut north through the Bungo Strait into the inland sea. Captain Toshio Abe kept her at about 20 knots and zigzagging to make targeting difficult. All exterior lights were extinguished. Lookouts scanned the black horizon. They knew American submarines prowled these waters. Still, with Japan's coast nearby, Abe hoped to slip through unseen. Around 10:30 p.m., Shinano's lookouts spotted a submarine's conning tower in the moonlight. One escort, Isukaze, rushed to attack. Captain Toshio Abe, suspecting a decoy, called it back. Instead, Shinano turned away and increased speed to try to outrun the sub. For a while, it seemed she might escape, but just before midnight, a mechanical problem forced Shinano to slow to 18 knots, about the same speed as the pursuing sub. Archerfish kept pace and maneuvered into position to strike. In the early hours of November 29, 1944, the opportunity finally came. Shinano made a wide zigzag turn that exposed her entire side to the lurking Archerfish. At 3:15 a.m., Archerfish fired a spread of 6 torpedoes from close range and then dove deep. Minutes later, 4 colossal explosions ripped into Shinano's starboard side. The torpedoes had hit their mark. The first torpedo blasted open compartments near the stern, including refrigerated stores and an empty aviation fuel tank, ripping a huge gash below the armored belt. The second struck further forward, crumpling bulkheads around one of the engine rooms and flooding it. The third detonated under a boiler room, obliterating that compartment and causing 2 adjacent boiler rooms to flood as well. The fourth hit near an air compressor room and magazines, wrecking another damage control station and rupturing a fuel oil tank. In less than 2 minutes, Shinano had suffered grievous wounds along a vast stretch of her starboard side. Critically, many compartments that should have been watertight were not sealed due to her incomplete state. Flooding spread far beyond the initial blast zones. Within minutes, Shinano began listing to starboard under the weight of thousands of tons of seawater. At first, nobody panicked. The crew had some basic training in damage control, and the officers believed Shinano's massive size and armor would keep her afloat. After all, she was the largest and best protected carrier in the world. Surely she could absorb a few torpedo hits. Damage control teams rushed to combat the flooding. Pumps were activated where possible, and counter-flooding was ordered on the port side to try to correct the list. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe assessed the situation. The starboard engine and boiler rooms were badly flooded, but there were no raging fires or secondary explosions. By about 15 minutes after the hits, Shinano's list was roughly 10 degrees to starboard, concerning, but not yet near fatal, for a ship of her width. Captain Abe remained optimistic and refused to slow down, but forging ahead at 18 knots only forced more water into Shinano's hull. Minutes ticked by, and her list worsened. The crew pumped out water as best they could, and briefly held the list around 12 degrees. But before long, more compartments were slowly flooding through unseen cracks and open hatches. By around 5 a.m., 2 hours after the attack, Shinano was listing over 15 degrees and settling lower in the water despite all efforts. Realizing now that the damage was far worse than hoped, Abe made a last-ditch move. He ordered Shinano to turn toward the nearest land, Shiono Point on Honshu, aiming to beach the ship in shallower water. He also directed additional counter-flooding on the port side to reduce the list. These measures gave only temporary relief. Soon, the starboard list increased again. By dawn, the list had exceeded 20 degrees. Flooding soon killed her remaining boilers, and by 7 a.m. Shinano was dead in the water, still taking on water and helpless. The escorts did everything possible to assist. Hamikaze and Isukaze tried to tow Shinano, but the sinking Leviathan barely moved. The destroyers simply lacked the power to tow a 70,000-ton ship now heavy with water. By 9 a.m., Shinano lost all power, plunging her interior into darkness and silencing her pumps. At this point, it was clear nothing could save the ship. Captain Toshio Abe finally turned his attention to saving lives. Around 10 a.m., with Shinano listing over 30 degrees, he ordered the crew to prepare to abandon ship. The carrier's huge flight deck was now tilted like a sinking ramp, making movement perilous. Crewmen scrambled to launch life rafts or simply jumped into the cold sea. The destroyers edged in to rescue as many men as they could. Following the honored tradition of Japanese captains, Captain Toshio Abe chose to remain on the bridge and go down with his ship, as did 2 of his senior officers. At 10:57 a.m. on November 29th, 1944, about 7.5 hours after the torpedo strike, Shinano capsized to starboard and sank. The massive carrier rolled completely over and slid stern first beneath the waves. As she went down, a thunderous roar of collapsing metal echoed across the sea. For an unlucky few, the powerful suction and whirlpool dragged dozens of men down with the ship. In moments, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. The human cost was staggering. Of roughly 2,515 souls on board, about 1,435, including Captain Abe, went down with Shinano. Approximately 1,000 were plucked from the water by the escorts. Those survivors were quarantined on a small island, and the Japanese Navy enforced a strict news blackout to keep the loss of Shinano secret. Meanwhile, USS Archerfish slipped away. Right after firing, Enright had taken his sub deep to evade depth charges. The angry escorts plastered the area with explosives, but when Shinano's fate became obvious, they turned back to rescue survivors, allowing Archerfish to escape. Enright and his crew, listening underwater, heard rumblings and breaking up noises for over 40 minutes after their attack, convincing them that their target was sinking. At daybreak, Archerfish cautiously surfaced to find only empty ocean. They didn't know exactly what they had destroyed, but they knew it was something enormous. Shinano's sinking was a devastating blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy, though it remained secret until after the war. The loss of such a colossal ship just days after commissioning was unprecedented. Japan could ill afford it. By late 1944, the Empire had only a handful of carriers left, none anywhere near Shinano's size, and almost no capacity to build more. Plans for Shinano to serve as a mobile support base never materialized. Those special weapons she carried would have to find other ways to reach the front. Losing Shinano without ever serving even a fraction of her purpose was a bitter pill for Japan. The squandered potential and wasted resources embodied the nation's waning fortunes. For the Japanese, Shinano's demise taught several hard lessons. Shinano was pushed out to sea in an incomplete state. A weak joint in her hull, where the original battleship armor met the added carrier section, proved disastrous. All 4 torpedoes struck along this seam, magnifying the damage. Many compartments hadn't been pressure tested for watertightness. Leaks and gaps went unnoticed in the rush. Critical equipment, like pumps and backup generators, wasn't fully installed or operational. In short, sending an unready ship to sea cost Shinano her life. The crew had been aboard barely 10 days and was not fully drilled. When crisis came, they fought bravely, but without the coordination of a seasoned crew. Confusion and delays hampered efforts to isolate flooding and run pumps. The presence of 300 civilian technicians on board, untrained for combat situations, only added to the chaos. Even a supership is only as effective as the crew that mans her. Captain Toshio Abe initially underestimated the threat. Instead of stopping or slowing to contain the flooding, he kept the ship moving, which only worsened the ingress of water. This misjudgment proved fatal. Had Shinano immediately focused on damage control, she might have survived longer. In this case, human error and pride compounded the ship's physical vulnerabilities. On the American side, Shinano's destruction was a major success, although the US Navy didn't realize its significance at first. Enright reported sinking a large enemy vessel, but since Shinano's existence was unknown, Navy intelligence assumed it was a smaller carrier. Only after the war did the Allies learn the astonishing truth. Archerfish had sunk the world's biggest carrier. Enright earned the Navy Cross for this feat. Strategically, Shinano's loss underscored the power of undersea warfare and the vulnerability of even the mightiest ships. By late 1944, US submarines were decimating Japan's supply lines, and now they had taken out Japan's new crown jewel. In a broader sense, Shinano's fate symbolized Japan's dire position in late 1944. The era of Japanese naval dominance had ended. Even its grandest projects could be cut down before they had any impact. It's ironic that a relatively small submarine could destroy a supercarrier that took Japan years of effort and vast resources to build. Her legacy embodied ambition versus reality. Conceived as a final trump card for a beleaguered empire, she instead became a testament to the unforgiving nature of war at sea and Imperial Japan's continued downward spiral.